There's definitely a big difference as far as education about our history, especially about the World War II Japanese American incarceration. And on the East Coast, I still have people that say, "Oh, well, they read like a sentence in a book, about certainly about the Pearl Harbor or World War II. They may know something about the Japanese American incarceration, but that's it. They don't know the in-depth inhumanity of the whole time in history, and what people went through, how they suffered, how they lost not only their property and possessions, but their dignity. And that's what a lot of the Muslims are facing today, as being targeted, and what's happening down at our borders. So the parallels. What I try to bring is to show people the parallels between the Japanese American incarceration of World War II and what's happening now. Whether it's down at the border, the separation of families. I mean, we had separation of families, the day after Pearl Harbor in 1941. So it's not something new that the government has done. They even had registration. We were kind of outraged when we were talking about the Muslim registration. Well, there was, the Japanese registration after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this is the pattern, right, that this country has taken in our history. And that's what people need to realize so that we stop it. If we don't understand what's happened in the past, then we can't stop it. We can't make that change. We can't, address those issues of inequality and racism. I think people thought that the Japanese American incarceration was just a Japanese American issue or a West Coast issue, right? But this is an American story. This is about America. And that's why it's so important to bring that to the forefront, because that's why my father fought the Japanese American incarceration, because at the end of the day, he was an American. He just happened to be of Japanese ancestry. And, what happened after World War II is that, the Japanese Americans especially, they just wanted to get on with their lives. And it was so painful for them to talk about it. They lost their dignity, they lost their property, and they just wanted to start over and show that they were good American citizens. And it's interesting because even talking to families where they have World War II veterans in their families, a lot of these soldiers, they didn't even want to talk about that time. So it's that generation, I think, that we can say they found it difficult. I mean, we just had the 75th commemoration of D-Day, right? And all these veterans that went to, were there at Normandy to honor this. It's like the first time they had ever even talked about this, and to, I think they were amazed how people wanted to take their picture and interview them, and to let them know that they are American heroes. And so it is that generation that was very quiet about their experiences. It just was too painful. I think it's generational, definitely, because it wasn't just my father that didn't talk about the incarceration. It was a whole community. But then it was also that generation that included the World War II, veterans, as well as the 442nd and 100th Battalion, which was the Japanese American units that were the still to this day the most decorated unit military for military in the United States. So, and I've met some of those veterans as well, and it's not like they're going to sit down and tell you their story. It's you have to almost drag it out of them. but they felt so strong about, representing their country as well, which is another part of our history. I like to point out that it was when the 442nd was created, and they were back in Mississippi, and there was a conflict between the 100th Battalion, which came from Hawaii, and the 442nd. And one of the generals took the 100th Battalion to one of the incarceration camps in Arkansas. I don't remember if it was Jerome or Rower. But when these soldiers saw that these families were behind barbed wire, yet their sons were fighting for this country, it really made them think differently about what it is to fight for this country and to be an American. I'm always correcting people that it says, Japanese internment, and it was the Japanese American internment. 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated in concentration camps across this country. 2/3 were American citizens. And 1/3 of those were children under the age of 18. There was also Japanese internment even in Siberia, where they had kidnapped really the Japanese in Mongolia and took them to labor camps. There were Japanese internment camps in China, and as well as Japan. So the word, the description needs to be clarified, because it happened on American soil, and that's what's so outrageous. When I first started speaking, I talked about in terms of the Japanese American concentration camps, and had a lot of pushback. They would say, "Karen, you can't call them concentration camps. That only happened in Germany." Well, I said, it was worse in Germany, because those really were death camps, the majority of them. And even though there are many people that were in the Japanese American concentration camps, incarceration camps, they thought they were going to get killed, that they were going to be shot. In fact, some people were shot in these camps for one reason or another. And so it's not kind of exclusive. It no matter how you look at it, it's a tragedy, and it's actually inhumane. But I think people don't realize, they kind of are in this mode of, well, it's going to happen to them, but not happen to me, right? And that's human nature. You have to kind of look at this as what's human nature, but that doesn't mean that it's acceptable. It just means that obviously they need to be educated about these differences, and then also because with the Holocaust, I mean, that happened on German soil, right? That was in Europe, and to this day people are in denial about the Japanese American concentration camps in this country. Oh, that didn't happen. And then you have to go into, well, yes, it did. So we've got a long ways to go before we really have people understand this historical perspective, and to understand that at the end of the day, we're all humans. And in this country, we're all Americans. And I have to say that being an American in this country means to support citizens and non-citizens. That's a true American. And that's what I try to encourage people to understand, because we have a responsibility for people that come to this country. They want, the history of this country is immigration. All of a sudden, immigration was like a dirty word. And I find that outrageous, because this country was built on the backs of immigrants, like my grandparents, on both sides of my family. And I want people to understand that, to understand that we should be proud that we are immigrants, that we have helped to build this country. It's not perfect. We have our imperfections, but we really should be proud of what we have achieved. Sometimes it's 3 steps forward, it's 2 steps back. That's democracy. But our democracy is on attack, and we need to work towards making sure that we make that strong. Liberty is important to everyone. Certainly after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Japanese Americans were targeted, right? It was like their fault. They looked like the enemy, and certainly that parallel carried over to what happened after 9/11, when the Muslims were being also targeted and almost like accused of that was their fault for the bombing of or the planes going into Twin Towers and the bombing of the Pentagon, or the plane going into the Pentagon. So in that context, that's a strong parallel. I think that's why the Japanese American community was the first to speak up after 9/11, to remind this country that you did this in 1942. Don't do this again. You're trying to pigeonhole this situation. It's like we're too quick to blame those people we can identify. I mean, it was even in the time of General John DeWitt, when he issued Executive Order 9066. It was for the Japanese Americans. It was like you can't separate the sheep from the goats. That's why they all have to be put in prison camps. And that was kind of the attitude also after 9/11. So it's not anything new. It's not excusable. And because we did not learn the lessons of 1942, of the World War II Japanese American incarceration, here we are. The backstory to really the Japanese American incarceration is agriculture. So as we do in this country, when we want cheap labor, like we recruited the Chinese to work on our railroads, right? And we went into Japan at the turn of, or at the 1900s, when the economy was very bad, very poor in Japan, and the government went to the 5 prefectures, meaning counties, that were heavily agricultural, and recruited people like my grandfather. Come to America, land of opportunity. We will help you, in your work. You can do well here. We'll give you land in some cases. But then, on the other hand, we're going to treat you like slaves. We're going to marginalize you. There'll be prejudice. None of those things that are ever even told, right? That's what they experienced. And that's how this agriculture belt was created up and down the West Coast. And the backstory also is that the Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans were doing so well. The cry was, they're taking away our jobs. Well, now where have we heard this before? This is how history is repeated. We're doing that to the Mexicans and the Latinos. They're taking away our jobs. They're coming to our country. We can't have them. And they did that to the Chinese. They did that to the Japanese. And now, here we are again. And even in targeting Muslims, that they're coming over to take our tech jobs. So this is the issue. This is at the core of why we have not learned our history, why we need to, quote, stop repeating history, and to educate people that we all belong here. We all have something to contribute. We've lost respect in this country. It's quite clear. And that's what I'm trying to help, especially this generation of students, realize, that moral principles of right and wrong, of treating other people like they want to be treated, is something that will take you through your entire life. or should take you through your entire life. And that's why we want people to understand our history, because we go from one issue to the next, and here we are. We're all born the same, more or less. I mean, we have our different economic issues and neighborhoods and ethnicities and those kinds of challenges. But we're all born as human beings. So what happens when we do not learn moral principles of right and wrong? It's not complicated. We try to make everything so complicated in this country, but it's very simple. There is no gray area. You're either right or you're wrong. And we try to rationalize, we try to really argue away the core of what should be true to ourselves. And if we're true to ourselves and have that understanding, then we can contribute. I mean, that's what being an American is. When you actually are civically engaged, and that's something else that I've been talking about, is to be part of our community. So when you're civically engaged and we push civic education, you're not only doing this for your own community, your state, and this nation, you're also doing this for yourself. And that just makes you a better person. And isn't that what we all want to be? Don't we all want to be better people? Don't we, the American dream of, you hear these stories of people who are born with really nothing, and they are able to build themselves up and build businesses and contribute to this country. That's what we all should be striving for. And it may sound a bit Pollyanna, but somewhere along the way, we have lost that core value. And it's the core values that we need to concentrate on remembering, on learning, on sharing, and teaching. To him, the Japanese American incarceration was wrong. To be put into prison was wrong. And he was right to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do this. Why should I be put in a prison camp when I've done nothing wrong? It wasn't complicated, and that's what resonates with so many people when I talk about my father and talk about his story, because he was a humble, kind, generous person that he would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it, literally. Now, I don't know too many people, quite honestly. I know this is my daddy, but I don't really know too many people who live by their principles of right and wrong. It's always kind of a gray area that they're walking this fine line, right? This tightrope. Nah, not him. And so he's my inspiration. That's why his story, as Dale says, and the legal team, my father's legal team loved my father and my mother, who was the cheerleader. But, because he was so true to his own values. And that's important. That's an important lesson to teach, because you think people automatically know that. They don't. And so that's why it always gives me, great pleasure to share, that part of my father's story, because that's what inspires. I mean, that's why we have Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution on my father's birthday of January 30th. So that was actually established by Assemblymember Warren Furutani from California, and then Assemblymember Block, that they created this legislative bill that was really nonpartisan. Both sides of the aisle, both the Senate and the House passed it with flying colors. And that's how we have Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution, because it's about education. That's like in the first paragraph of the bill. And it's even though it's in perpetuity, meaning it's forever, the governor of California, whoever that is, declares it Fred Korematsu Day. The superintendent of education instruction also encourages teachers to teach about my father's story, his fight for justice, and how it relates to our issues today of immigration and racial profiling and national security. In context of the World War II Japanese American incarceration. And it's not a holiday yet. We need to have several, I've been told, several states under our belt, so to speak, a majority of them, before you could have a federal holiday. But it's amazing because the state of Hawaii, the Commonwealth of Virginia, as they like to be referred to, and the state of Florida, and New York City, all have the day in perpetuity. And in fact, my favorite story is the state of Florida was established by students, 7th graders. So their teacher in Clearwater Fundamental School in Clearwater, Florida, was teaching about the Japanese American incarceration and about my father. And so kids, being kids, Googled Fred Korematsu, and they saw that other states had Fred Korematsu Day. And of course, they wanted Fred Korematsu Day. They really wanted a holiday, but that's okay. We'll take it. And they had a state senator visit them at their school, civic education, 7th grade. And they expressed to the senator what they wanted. And he said, it's like the lesson of how do you create a bill, the cartoon. He said, if you write letters to me, I will create a bill. And I will take it to the Senate. And he did, and it passed. And then he had a colleague who took it to the House, and it passed. And that's how we have Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution for the state of Florida by the power of the pen of 7th graders, of students. For my father taking the stand to disobey this military order, I don't think he realized the magnitude of it. It wasn't complicated to him. He was an American citizen. He grew up just like any other American kid. He was born in Oakland, California. He had never been to Japan. He barely could speak any Japanese. It was more like children's Japanese. And so, when this executive order was issued, certainly my grandparents were very afraid because they're immigrants. I mean, they wanted to become American citizens, but that law didn't even change until 1952. So, but he said, why should I be put in a prison camp when he had done nothing wrong? And that's basically how he made his decision. It wasn't complicated for him, and he learned about the Constitution in high school. He thought he had rights as an American citizen, and that's all it took. If you look at, especially our American civil rights heroes, if you look at Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Rosa Parks, Fred Korematsu, they were all people of peace. They were about peace. They believed in their own convictions. It wasn't really complicated to them either. Rosa Parks just refused to sit at the back of the bus. Not complicated. Fred Korematsu refused to be put in a prison camp. Not complicated. But they all had this inner, I want to say, strength or value that they probably couldn't even explain to you. And that's what makes them civil rights heroes. Because a hero doesn't go out to say, I'm going to be a hero. It doesn't work that way. And it's what people label them afterwards. It's not what they label themselves. My father never thought of himself as a hero. And and I'm sure, the other civil rights heroes never thought of themselves that way as well. It was what they believed in, their convictions of what they wanted to work for, what they wanted this country to be. That was what made them a hero, and that's how we have given that label to others like my father. My father was 23 years old when the executive order was issued, right? So his birthday is January 30th. So he was, 22 at that time. So he was 23 years old, a young man, right? He was of legal age. And my grandparents, from what he told me, were so, they were so concerned about their own lives, their own livelihood. I think what pains me is that the Japanese Americans had worked so hard on their businesses, on raising their families, and then to be stripped away from all that, right? In one brushstroke, without any due process of law. That was what was so outrageous. That was no one had a charge, no one had a hearing, no one had a day in court. The 4th and 14th Amendments were totally violated, all because of what we called then military necessity, which we now call national security. See the parallel? So it was very scary time for them, and their opinion was my father was old enough to make his own decision. Certainly, he brought shame to the family once they were all put in the incarceration camps, and my father did go it alone, but he didn't talk about it. He kept it all to himself, and just carried on and just kept pushing and just believed that someday that the wrong would be a right. It's interesting because what I try to encourage people to do now, especially young people, as we move away from our generation, especially the World War II generation, is to go home and find out their own story, because once they know their own story, they can appreciate other people's stories. Where did they come from? What were their struggles? What were the challenges? What did they have to sacrifice? How do they feel about that now? Because I never did that. I wish I could have, it's kind of like after the fact, I wish I would have sat down my father and asked him all these questions. But I didn't do that. And so he didn't volunteer it. In fact, I've had students tell me that their parents won't talk about the Japanese American incarceration, or that their grandfathers in World War II won't, that are still living, won't talk about that time. And I said, no, they won't. But you need to tell them that it's for a school assignment. And start asking them questions, but ask them general questions, not so personal to begin with. What was happening at that time? Where were they? How did they feel? And then maybe try to ask them those personal questions, because I wish I had done that. Because who would have thought my father's legacy would have grown to be so impactful at this time, right? So, when I'm talking to a group, certainly my father received the Presidential Medal of Freedom on January 15th, 1998, for his fight for justice and the fight really for the ultimately for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that was signed by President Reagan. But you never know what's going to happen to someone's legacy after they pass away, right? And you don't predict that. And my eyes, my father was going to kind of live forever, which is not reasonable, but it was emotional. And so when these things started popping up, like the assembly members that wanted to create Fred Korematsu Day, now we have 4 schools named after my father. 3 in the San Francisco Bay Area, 1 in Sacramento, an elementary school, and then in the Bay Area there's a high school an elementary school and a middle school. Who would have thought that would have happened? And because also it's interesting. My father's Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States, is studied in constitutional law in law schools. So that's also how students have come to me to ask me to speak to them at their schools, universities, and because they've learned about this case and it's about a real person, but it's also about one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court ever made, right? That's the reality of it. But also because the case still resonates today. It still means that we have not addressed those issues of racism and prejudice, and the negative rhetoric that we're hearing today. I think my involvement just happened kind of over time. My father passed away in 2005. So I was fortunate enough to be able to travel with my parents about 4 years before my father passed away. And my mother didn't pass away until she was 92 and a half in 2013, which was, 6 years ago. So, I was able to hear more of my father's story, that way. But because people started reaching out to me, my civil rights advocacy, started when my father's case was reopened in 1983. So that's when I was starting to do more with the Asian American community, and they would just kind of draw me in. It's not anything I did, on purpose. It was just over time. Karen, would you do this? Karen, would you do that? Would you come speak? And I thought, not me. I'm not the public speaker, So that kind of, took some time to be comfortable, so that's, it just. But because this was so important to my father, right, that he didn't want something like the Japanese American incarceration to happen again. That's why he crisscrossed this country and continued to speak 5 months before he passed away at the age of 86. That he could have very well said, well, Japanese American community, you didn't want anything to do with me. Why should I have anything to do with you? But he wasn't like that. And he just wanted people to learn the lessons of history so we would not repeat them. His advocacy didn't start until his coram nobis case was vacated in November 1983. And that was little by little because it was the same process. People wanted him, invited him to come and speak, and he, I don't know, well, just show up, okay, I'll show up. And then people would ask him questions, and then he got a little bit more comfortable. And that's been my process as well. I think because, I could see how that was so important to my father. And I think as Americans, we all have the responsibility of making this country better. And if I can do that in some small way, by speaking out, by pointing to these historical parallels, then and try to change hearts and minds. How do we change hearts and minds in this country? Oh my gosh, it's such a big challenge. But if we all did that, if we all understood the inhumanity, that's what bothers me, is the human rights violations that we keep, really building up, and to a point now where we're still separating families at the border. That's not American. We haven't learned our lessons of history. This is a big country, and we need to get people, involved. So now I'm encouraging people to be civically engaged, to participate If we don't all participate in this country, we are not going to make change. That means voting, whether it's, in your community, your state, your nation. Our census that's coming out in 2020, I'm very afraid that people are going to say, oh no, if I do the census, then they're going to come get me, right? And if people aren't encouraged to participate in the census, then we can't create those programs to support our communities. People need to be counted. We need to have that representation. We need to give that support to communities. It's all trickles down to how we can support each other as Americans, and that's what's so important today. I feel in my responsibility to encourage people and to motivate them and to show the urgency that if we don't do something, we're going to be in big trouble. And look at our environment, which is a totally different issue, because I'm really afraid about our environment and about this climate change issue. And it all connects. There's no separate parts. It all connects. It's all in one. And at the end of the day, it's about what it means to be an American citizen and what it means to participate, to uphold those rights. People use, we've seen this in the past where voting, our voting numbers are just so bad. It's like a throwaway. This is a privilege that we have in this country. I travel around the world where countries aren't able to vote, or they have these struggles, or they want to vote and they're being, turned away for some reason or another. I mean, we still have our issues. Don't get me wrong. We still have voting rights issues, language access, but that's what people need to work on so that we can make that change. This current president issued his first executive order on January 27, 2017, that was called the Muslim ban, right? And then it became the immigration ban, because, and then it became the travel ban. And that's what we do in this country. We try to water down the impact. It's like the euphemisms. Like one of the words that I totally hate regarding the Japanese American incarceration of World War II is evacuation. Now, I can tell you, 5-year-olds know the difference. They can tell you that if they live in earthquake country, tornado country, hurricane country, and now we're dealing with guns, what evacuation means. And because the people were forcibly removed. So those were kind of the euphemisms that were being put out there in 1942. And so we try to water down the impact of targeting of like especially the Muslims. And so when the Trump versus Hawaii case was launched, we said, well, we need to show the courts the parallels. We need to remind the courts of the parallels between the Japanese American incarceration and what's being done now to Muslims, because it's racial profiling. It was racial profiling in 1942. Now it's racial profiling and religious profiling. Talk about violation of Constitution rights, and that's wrong. And so that's why, we're thinking, well, the responsibility is we need to speak up. The Japanese American community needs to speak up. And so we had an amicus brief that was, we have the Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality at Seattle University School of Law. So that was established in 2009. My mother and I, she was still living, sanctioned that, and I established the Fred Korematsu Institute in 2009 as well. So at the same time in April, and the Korematsu Center for Law and Equality is certainly academia, but they have worked on amicus briefs as well. They have their law students work on these briefs, and so it was kind of a natural that they would be the ones to work on this amicus brief, along with Aiken Gump in New York City. All did it pro bono, So meaning, for free, because it took hours and hours and hours and hours to put this brief together. But at the end of the day, what we wanted to do was to remind the court of the parallels of the Japanese-American incarceration of World War II and what's happening now to Muslims with the, quote, Muslim travel ban. And to remind the court of the dangers of overreaching of power, that we have three branches of government, which we're still trying to get the public to, what are they? And you have the executive branch and our judicial and our legislative. So one branch should not be an overreaching of power to another. That's why they're separated. That's why the Constitution did that. That's why our forefathers, wanted those separations, because they wanted to act independently. Checks and balances, rule of law. Those are points that we need to remember. And so that was the point of the amicus brief that I put my name to. And because Korematsu versus the United States is considered the major case of the other two, Hirabayashi and Yasui had to do with the curfew. But my father disobeyed the military orders. So it's considered, that's why it's the most studied, case. And so I was really quite surprised and pleased that Justice Sotomayor mentioned my name in her dissent. But the point of the majority opinion and majority decision, it was 5-4. It wasn't unanimous. And Justice Sotomayor, along with Ginsburg, wrote one opinion, and Justice Breyer and Kagan wrote the other dissenting opinion. And it, clearly and I'm not an attorney, so my personal opinion is that Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, went to the jugular. She got to the point. She said, this is wrong, and cited my name in her decision. Dissenting it, or her dissenting opinion, I should say. Certainly, I was honored, but that's what needs to be studied, because she reminds the court and this country that we are still making the same mistakes. That to target a group of people is wrong, and we need to keep fighting that. Now, also my personal opinion. When Chief Justice Roberts issued his majority opinion, and something that people don't realize, because even I have said in the past, my father's Coram Nobis case, his Korematsu versus the United States, his Coram Nobis case, it was the federal conviction that was vacated. It's the case itself still stood on the Supreme Court record, right? It could still be used as precedent. And it would take something of outrageous means to bring it up again, as it did in the case of Trump versus Hawaii. And so when the Supreme Court justices all read what their opinions are, so they know. So when Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, wrote his opinion, and getting to the point of, because he agreed, he upheld the opinion. When he said in his opinion that this has nothing to do with Korematsu, meaning Trump versus Hawaii has nothing to do with Korematsu versus United States. Then he goes on to say, however, Korematsu versus the United States was wrong. It should not, is just a wrong decision and not part of our Constitution. And so he's going to take the opportunity to overrule it. Now, constitutional scholars, you can ask them, what did Justice Roberts actually overrule? That's still debatable. And could my father's Supreme Court case still be used again? Who knows? It would have to find its way in maybe in another case that would address that. But Justice Roberts, when he said that Korematsu versus United States has nothing to do with Trump versus Hawaii, and was going to overrule Korematsu and marginalize the Muslims and other ethnicities, he dishonored my father, all in the same breath. It's almost like he used my father's name in vain. Justice Roberts used my father's name in vain to make a point, because his opinion, the way that many of us look at it, was just like a throwaway. When he overruled Korematsu, it was a throwaway. It was like in retaliation for Justice Sotomayor's opinion. And that's not what a Supreme Court justice should be doing. That's not their role. They should be better than that. Executive orders go back to the time of our first president, President Washington. And he used executive orders as really directives to the military. Now, in the Constitution, there is nothing in there that specifically phrases executive order. Certainly, the Constitution gives executive power to the president, right? And so it really wasn't until Roosevelt, as far as I know, when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, that it was used in a manner that targeted and marginalized Americans. And so, but it was interesting because all these years, people didn't, when we said Executive Order 9066, and we would talk about February 19th, and that was the Day of Remembrance, which is what the Japanese American community and now even other communities really commemorate to show the lessons of history, how they are still being repeated. It's interesting because people didn't know what executive orders were about. With this current president issuing this executive order, on January 27th, 2017, then all of a sudden it was like, oh, well, what is an executive order? Then people started realizing that the president had all this power to issue these orders that, were not positive in reality. They were negative. And that's not what really this country is about. So it's maybe something that needs to be addressed about executive orders. That's something maybe Congress can do or should be doing. I haven't been down to the border where they're separating families. And, certainly they've been putting them in Crystal City, Texas. And I know that Crystal City, Texas, and I haven't been there either, originally was a Department of Justice camp during the World War II Japanese-American incarceration. They had brought up, Peruvians and Latins, Japanese, to incarcerate them. I mean, that backstory is that they were kidnapped as well, the Japanese, Latins, and Peruvians, to be used as trade for prisoners of war. So there's that issue as well. And even I will point out that there was an incarceration in Canada. 20,000 Japanese Canadians were incarcerated on the west coast of Canada. So this is an international issue that obviously we have not addressed before, and that's why it's so important to draw these parallels. Now, the senator from Oregon created a bill called No Internment Camps, and so that's when I started, kind of having that communication with him. But it's the stories have trickled up, and I have friends, Japanese American friends, who have gone down there to to help bring really attention to what is happening down there. But the stories are the same. The conditions are inhumane. The families are being separated. It's a terrible situation that it's frustrating because of the way people are being treated. It's just plain inhumane. I will leave you with my father's words, because that is really the reminder. He said, "Stand up for what is right. When you see something wrong, protest, but not with violence. Otherwise, they won't listen to you. But don't be afraid to speak up." My father loved to speak to, especially attorneys, and because he knew that they would have the tools that would enable them to keep fighting for our civil liberties and our civil rights in this country and uphold the Constitution. But he wanted everyone to be part of that process, that we all need to participate. We can't let just, somebody else is going to do it. Well, I don't have time. And granted, everyone is busy. Everyone has busy lives, and I point that out. But if everyone participated a little bit here, a little bit there, maybe when they're older, obviously if their kids are in school, that they're all focused on that, they're on working. But maybe when their kids are out of school, they're empty nesters, they can get more involved in their community. There's ways of doing it, of supporting our communities in this nation, so that we, I'm sure no one wants their own children to have to face all this racism, all this prejudice, all this negative rhetoric, because that brings us down. And we're better than that as Americans. We have so much to do, and especially with our climate control and our environment. What are we leaving to this generation to face? It's a big problem. So that's what my father's message. That's why my father's story resonates on so many different levels, because at the root of it is social justice, and social justice is in all aspects of life and career and community, or it should be. And no matter what your discipline is, whether you're a scientist in the medical field, whether you're a teacher, whether you're in religion, whether you're in makeup and film, and a director, and it's very heartwarming when celebrities do speak up and try to make change, because that's using their status in a positive way. And that's what we need for our young people, to have those role models that are positive. That's why American civil rights heroes like Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez and Rosa Parks and Fred Korematsu is so important. That's why Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution is so important, because it represents the Asian American community. The Asian American community is the fastest growing community in the United States, right? Where is that representation? Where is that role model? And by having a day, a federal day recognized in his name, is the opportunity to bring that part of education to our history. That is important for all of us to remember. Because at the end of the day, when you tie all these stories together, all these American civil rights stories together, we are Americans, no matter if you're indigenous or you're an immigrant.